Johnny Carson wasn't just a host, he was America's midnight mirror. For 30 years, he shaped the rhythms of the late-night stage, deciding who belonged, who thrived, and who vanished back into the shadows. His smile could launch a career. His silence could end one.
My God, that's Frank Sinatra with $320. How would you like it, Frank? Large bills?
But the stage was never neutral. Behind the glamour, the rolling laughter, Carson saw something darker. Guests who arrived polished and celebrated, yet carried reputations that made even him uneasy. He didn't always say it directly, but in the spaces between his jokes, in the stories he shared off camera, the truth leaked out. Some of his golden age guests weren't just difficult. They were, by his quiet measure, something close to evil. Night after night, Carson revealed the country to itself. But when the mask slipped, he revealed the guests too. And not all of them came out clean. Their names glowed in lights, but their shadows whispered warnings. Here are the 7 Golden Age guests Johnny Carson saw not as legends, but as living warnings. Number 1, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was more than a guest. He was royalty on Carson's stage. But the crooner's presence came with an aura of menace. Behind the tuxedo and the effortless charm were well-documented ties to organized crime, whispered threats, and a reputation for vengeance. Carson, who respected craft but feared intimidation, once hinted that having Sinatra on set felt like inviting the mob into your living room.
I've forever, and I sang the very first song.
His voice was golden, but his shadow was long. For Carson, who built his career on balance and subtle control, Sinatra represented something volatile. When Sinatra walked through the curtain, the audience rose in a swell of applause that seemed to bend the room. But Carson, master of understatement, often studied his guest with the same caution he gave a heckler, measuring the weight of charm against the danger underneath. Sinatra's connections were an open secret. Journalists chronicled his friendships with Sam Giancana and other figures whose names carried menace. Stories of Vegas nights, favors traded, debts whispered rather than written followed him everywhere. Carson, who relied on rhythm and trust, knew this was a man whose reputation extended far beyond music. With Frank, you never knew if the laugh would turn into a threat. The Tonight Show was built on safety, America's living room. But when Sinatra was on the couch, that room felt armored. He told stories, crooned a line, delivered jokes with timing that earned thunderous applause. Yet beneath the charm was the quiet recognition that few dared push him.
Apparently, I don't know how deep that feud was, but apparently they had not really
it was 20 years old.
20 years, and they hadn't really...
Yeah.
How'd that come about?
Well,
Carson respected the artistry, but he never forgot the shadows. Crew members whispered about Sinatra's demands. He traveled with an entourage that moved like security, loyal and sharp-eyed. Stage managers spoke of the tension in cueing him, adjusting the format around his presence. Sinatra didn't adapt to the show. The show adapted to him. Carson turned that pressure into humor. He once quipped that booking Sinatra felt like negotiating with the State Department. Every word mattered, every glance was measured. The joke revealed the truth. When Sinatra was in the room, others grew smaller. Carson admired talent, but he distrusted domination. With Sinatra, the two were inseparable, and yet Carson knew the paradox. Sinatra was loved by millions. His records became soundtracks to weddings and heartbreaks. Songs like Fly Me to the Moon and My Way made him immortal. But for Carson, who lived in the subtle spaces between laughter and silence, the velvet of Sinatra's voice could never drown out the steel beneath it. The irony was sharp. Carson's wit usually disarmed the powerful, but with Sinatra, his jokes softened, careful not to cross invisible lines. For most guests, Carson stayed in command. With Sinatra, the balance shifted. In the end, Sinatra's visits embodied his dual legacy. To audiences, he was legend. To Carson, he was something more complicated. An artist whose brilliance and menace were inseparable. He embodied both the dream and the warning, the spotlight and the shadow. Carson never condemned him. He let the silence do the work. The pause between questions, the way he leaned back as Sinatra entered. Some guests you laugh with, some you survive. Sinatra, in Carson's memory, was both. And for the Tonight Show's master of balance, that made him unforgettable. not just for the songs that soared, but for the chill that lingered once they ended. Number 2, Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford arrived with the weight of old Hollywood prestige, but Carson never forgot the storm of stories surrounding her. Tales of cruelty to her adopted children, immortalized in Mommy Dearest, lingered like a curse.
I'm not the giant or the tycoon. I'm merely a member of the board of the directors of Pepsi-Cola. Can I mention it?
To Carson, who thrived on warmth and timing, Crawford's perfectionism carried something colder, an edge of control that bordered on tyranny. Her presence was magnetic, but it was also unsettling. Crawford embodied the golden age in every movement. She was elegance incarnate, with a posture that commanded attention and a gaze that could freeze a studio. On The Tonight Show, she spoke with poise, but Carson noticed what lingered between her words, a calculation that turned every exchange into a performance of control. To most, it looked like confidence. To Carson, it felt like a fortress. Her reputation preceded her. Hollywood insiders whispered about her severity long before Mommy Dearest made it legend. Directors admired her professionalism, but crew members described a woman who demanded loyalty through fear. Joan didn't just want respect, she demanded submission. Carson, who valued chemistry and generosity, bristled at the imbalance. In his world, timing thrived on trust. With Crawford, trust felt like a contract written in ice. On stage, she sparkled. Crawford's voice carried gravitas, her smile commanded cameras. But Carson, ever the observer, noticed the absence of warmth. She was performing even when she wasn't acting. The Tonight Show couch was built for relaxation and banter. With Crawford seated, spontaneity froze. Conversations bent to her will, each line delivered as if the audience were a jury. Carson joked with her, of course. That was his craft. But unlike other guests, he measured his words carefully. He avoided the sharper edges of humor, sensing that a misplaced quip might not just wound pride but invite retaliation. For Carson, who thrived on playful risk, restraint was revealing. With Crawford, laughter came with conditions. Behind the glamour, darker stories gnawed at her image. The accounts from her children, accusations of punishments and cruelty, were known in hushed tones long before the book gave them voice. Carson never repeated them on air, but off camera, colleagues recalled his unease. He once remarked privately that inviting Crawford felt like sharing a smile with someone who had already written the verdict. The paradox was sharp. Crawford wanted to be adored, and for much of her career she was. Audiences flocked to see her in Mildred Pierce, Grand Hotel, Johnny Guitar.
Anything so ridiculous about that?
If I were you, I'd save myself the trouble.
She reinvented herself across decades, refusing to fade as the studio system collapsed. That drive, that ferocity, was admirable, but Carson recognized what fueled it, a hunger for control that left little room for grace. Carson's Tonight Show was a space of rhythm, conversations rising and falling like jazz. With Crawford, rhythm collapsed. It became monologue. She did not join the dance. She conducted it. To audiences at home, it looked like command. To Carson, it felt like tyranny disguised as charm. In the end, Crawford's legacy lived in paradox. She was both icon and warning, talent and terror. On the Tonight Show couch, she glittered like old Hollywood itself, beautiful, commanding, untouchable. But Carson, who understood the cost of masks, saw something darker beneath the polish. Some legends leave you dazzled, others leave you cold. For Carson, Joan Crawford was both, her glamour unforgettable, her chill impossible to ignore. Number 3, Jerry Lee Lewis. When Jerry Lee Lewis walked onto Carson's stage, the energy was combustible. The rock and roll wild man carried scandal with him, marrying his 13-year-old cousin, living a life of excess that flirted constantly with ruin. Carson joked with him, but insiders whispered that off-camera Johnny saw the darkness. The talent was undeniable. The behavior was unforgivable. Lewis arrived like a storm. His piano playing wasn't music so much as attack. Keys pounded, chairs kicked, microphones knocked aside. On screen, it was spectacle. But for Carson, who valued precision and rhythm, it carried danger. He once quipped privately that booking Lewis felt like rolling dynamite across the stage and hoping it didn't go off. The scandal that defined Lewis's career hung heavy. In the late 1950s, his marriage to his young cousin nearly ended everything. Audiences recoiled, record sales collapsed, and his reputation shifted from rebel to pariah. By the time he reached Carson's stage, he had clawed his way back through sheer showmanship. But the shadow never lifted. On camera, Carson laughed at the wild stunts and sudden bursts of energy, yet the laughs carried an edge. You never quite knew if Jerry was playing a song or picking a fight. The Tonight Show couch was built for conversation. Lewis turned it into a proving ground. Behind the curtain, crew members told stories of chaos. Lewis arrived late, demanded drinks, ignored cues. His entourage carried the air of a party teetering toward collapse. Carson's producers, used to quirks, described Lewis as different, less eccentric, more volatile. With Jerry, the unpredictability wasn't charm, it was risk. And yet, the music itself was undeniable. When Lewis sat at the piano and launched into Great Balls of Fire or Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On, the studio erupted.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. You might love drive a man insane.
For a few minutes, chaos became art. Carson, ever the craftsman, admired that power. But admiration did not erase the unease. Carson's comedy relied on balance. He set the tone, guided rhythm, let guests shine while keeping control. With Lewis, control was impossible. He wasn't a guest, he was a fuse waiting to be lit. Carson adapted. Shorter questions, careful jokes, guarded body language whenever Lewis leaned too far. Lewis embodied the paradox Carson dreaded most. Brilliance entangled with destruction. He proved that talent could not excuse behavior. The Tonight Show depended on trust between host, guest, and audience. With Lewis, that trust cracked each time he played. Carson never condemned him. That wasn't his style. But the restraint, the guarded tone, the forced laughter spoke volumes. He let audiences enjoy the fire while calculating how close the flames might come. Jerry Lee Lewis left behind a legacy that reshaped rock and roll. But in Carson's world, he remained a reminder of the cost of chaos. Genius meant little if it destroyed the room around it. For Johnny Carson, Jerry Lee Lewis was unforgettable, not for the music that soared, but for the unease that lingered once the last note died. Number 4. Zsa Gabor. Zsa Gabor was a fixture of late-night glamour, always witty, always glittering. But Carson often hinted at the chaos she left behind her. Known for violent outbursts, courtroom scandals, and notorious arrests, she embodied the kind of self-absorbed destruction Johnny distrusted. The audience saw sparkle. Carson saw sharp edges that cut anyone too close. Gabor's appearances carried the gloss of old-world charm. Born in Hungary, she styled herself as royalty in exile, draped in diamonds, speaking with a thick accent that turned even ordinary lines into spectacle. On The Tonight Show, she was the perfect foil for Carson's dry wit. But beneath the laughter, Johnny recognized the turbulence. With Zsa, the laugh was real, but the fire was always close behind. Her personal life fueled that fire. 9 marriages, countless affairs, public fights splashed across headlines. The most infamous came in 1989, when she slapped a Beverly Hills police officer during a traffic stop.
You could have pled guilty and the thing...
Why shall I say guilty when I'm not guilty?
Carson, who built his stage on composure, couldn't ignore the irony. A woman who shined under the lights but unraveled the moment she was told no. On stage, she leaned into the caricature. She joked about husbands, about wealth, about her so-called royal bloodline. Audiences laughed, delighted by her outrageousness. Carson laughed too, but carefully. He once remarked that interviewing Gabor was like juggling with glass, entertaining until something shattered. He admired her timing, but distrusted her temper. Crew members recalled the tension that followed her backstage. She traveled with assistants, demanded champagne, and could turn from charm to fury in a heartbeat. One producer described her as a tornado wrapped in fur. For Carson, who prized professionalism beneath the jokes, Gabor represented the opposite, chaos dressed in couture. And yet, she was never boring. She had a gift for deflection, spinning scandal into punchlines, turning criticism into proof of her uniqueness. To the casual viewer, she seemed invincible. But Carson saw what it cost: the endless need to dominate attention, the inability to share space without controlling it. Carson's interviews thrived on generosity. He gave guests the stage, then wove himself back in with timing so seamless it felt effortless. With Gabor, that rhythm stumbled. She didn't wait for openings. She seized them, talking over others, chasing the spotlight. To viewers, it looked like sparkle. To Carson, it felt like combat disguised as comedy. Her legacy mirrored that contradiction. Gabor was never the greatest actress, never the most acclaimed performer, but she mastered the art of being famous, of turning scandal into currency, of making chaos look glamorous. That mastery made her a perfect late-night guest, but also a dangerous one. She proved that attention could be won through destruction as easily as talent. Carson's Tonight Show was about balance, laughter flowing like conversation among friends. With Zsa Zsa, balance was impossible. She gave you diamonds with one hand and claws with the other. He kept her close enough for the sparkle, but far enough to avoid the cut. In the end, Zsa Zsa Gabor left behind a legend built less on art than on theater. On Carson's stage, she shone like a star, but one that burned those who reached too close. For Johnny Carson, she was unforgettable. Not for what she created, but for the warning she embodied. That glamour without restraint is a blade hidden in light. Number 5. Orson Welles. Orson Welles arrived on Carson's stage as a legend, Citizen Kane incarnate. Yet behind the genius was a reputation for cruelty, arrogance, and manipulation.
Of course, anybody's scared to get out in front of the...
Carson admired Welles's brilliance, but insiders recall his private remarks. Welles devoured collaborators, leaving behind admiration mixed with bitterness. For Carson, genius that destroyed trust carried its own kind of evil. Welles's presence was immense. He entered with the confidence of a man who had once reshaped cinema itself. His baritone voice, his dramatic gestures, his stories spun like myths. It was theater more than conversation. Carson, who prized rhythm and spontaneity, often found himself yielding space to the performance. Talking with Orson was like being pulled into a play you didn't audition for. Carson respected that magnetism, but he also knew its cost. Hollywood was littered with stories of Welles's unfinished projects, abandoned crews, and alienated partners. From the magnificent Ambersons to the endless half-completed scripts, Welles's brilliance often collapsed under the weight of his own ego. On The Tonight Show, that history seemed to hang in the air.
I had intended to bring a little magical illusion with me, and I put it in the wrong jacket.
Behind the charm was a hunger for dominance. Producers whispered that Welles rarely answered questions directly. He redirected them, twisting interviews into showcases for himself. Carson, who thrived on give and take, adjusted by asking fewer questions and letting Welles run. It wasn't collaboration, it was surrender. And Carson, though amused, was not blind. He once remarked privately that working with Welles was like inviting a magician to dinner and realizing the trick was on you. The brilliance dazzled, but the manipulation lingered. The paradox of Welles fascinated Carson. On one hand, here was the man who, with Citizen Kane, had changed film forever. A visionary who turned shadows into power, who made cinema a language of psychology and memory. On the other hand, here was the same man whose temper alienated allies, whose arrogance consumed opportunities, whose endless appetite left collaborators drained. Carson admired innovation, but he valued trust more. The Tonight Show thrived because guests felt safe, because laughter could be shared without fear of being devoured. With Welles, safety was impossible. He demanded the spotlight until others disappeared. Orson didn't share the stage, he swallowed it. Still, there was awe. Carson knew audiences leaned forward when Welles spoke. His voice carried authority. His presence felt monumental. Even when he spun tall tales, even when exaggeration shaded into fiction, the spell worked. Carson played along, aware that what mattered was not the truth of Welles's stories, but their performance. Yet when the lights dimmed, Carson reflected differently. The laughter felt thinner. The admiration was tinged with wariness. For Johnny, the measure of greatness was not only what someone created, but what they left behind. Wells created masterpieces, but also wreckage. Carson's stage was built on generosity, on rhythm shared between host and guest. With Wells, rhythm dissolved into monologue. Audiences saw brilliance. Carson saw a cautionary tale, genius without grace, talent without trust. In the end, Wells embodied the irony Carson knew too well. A man could change the world and still leave destruction in his wake. He could be remembered as both titan and tyrant. For Carson, Orson Welles was unforgettable, not only for the brilliance he displayed, but for the warning he carried. That genius without balance does not illuminate, it consumes. Number 6. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was bold, unpredictable, and often unrestrained. Audiences loved her blunt confessions, but Carson privately saw danger in her volatility.
My mother said, "But do you expect me to live in it with a baby?" No, but okay, I got it so long.
Her antics made headlines, but her disregard for others' dignity made Johnny wary. To him, humor was about generosity. Winters' outbursts were closer to cruelty. Winters arrived on The Tonight Show with the reputation of a whirlwind. She was twice an Academy Award winner, celebrated for A Patch of Blue and The Diary of Anne Frank. But what set her apart on Carson's stage wasn't the accolades. It was her willingness to break the script. She interrupted, overshared, and treated the couch like her own confessional booth.
Most of them, you see, we made love to.
Most of them.
I would have remembered.
You've forgotten.
Carson admired candor. He built his interviews on honesty disguised as comedy. But Winters' candor was different, less revealing, more combative. With Shelley, the truth came like a slap instead of a smile. The audience roared, but Carson, who prized balance, braced himself. One infamous moment captured that unpredictability. During a crowded panel, Winters splashed a glass of water at another guest in mock outrage. The crowd howled, headlines followed, and Winters seemed delighted. Carson, however, leaned back, the trace of discomfort visible in his eyes. For him, The Tonight Show was about trust between strangers in front of millions. Winters' antics chipped at that trust. Behind the scenes, producers called her appearances unpredictable victories. Ratings spiked whenever she arrived, but the cost was high. Stage managers recalled the tension before her entrances, never knowing whether she would deliver biting wit or veer into hostility. You couldn't script Shelley, you just survived her. Winters thrived on breaking taboos. She spoke openly about her marriages, her affairs, her struggles with weight. Subjects most stars avoided. Audiences were stunned, sometimes shocked, often entertained. Carson knew her openness was revolutionary, but he also sensed its edge. She could make confession feel like a dagger. The charm of revelation was overshadowed by the sting of ridicule. Carson's humor was rooted in generosity, teasing without cruelty, creating laughter without humiliation. Winters' comedy often left casualties. Guests squirmed, the balance of the stage shifted, and Carson had to recalibrate mid-show. And yet, there was brilliance. Winters' raw energy carried truth that most actors hid. She stripped away artifice, forcing audiences to confront the messy humanity behind celebrity. Carson respected that courage, even as he feared the damage it caused. The paradox defined her, captivating and corrosive at the same time. To viewers, Winters was unforgettable. To Carson, she was a reminder that chaos could be mistaken for charm and cruelty for honesty. The Tonight Show relied on rhythm, trust, and generosity, qualities Winters often pushed aside in pursuit of shock. Carson never condemned her on air. He smiled, he rolled with the punches, he turned her volatility into fuel for laughs. But in private, his unease lingered. Winters embodied the danger of entertainment without restraint. In the end, Shelley Winters left her mark on late-night television as both pioneer and disruptor. She proved that bluntness could captivate, but also wound. For Johnny Carson, she was unforgettable not because she dazzled, but because she revealed how easily humor can turn into harm. Number 7. Richard Nixon. The most unsettling guest was not an actor or singer, but a president. Richard Nixon's appearances on The Tonight Show carried the weight of politics, paranoia, and scandal. Carson joked, but never forgot that Nixon's legacy was built on lies, surveillance, and betrayal. To have him on the couch was to confront the reality that evil didn't always wear a mask. It could wear a suit and smile on television. Nixon was unlike any other guest Carson faced. Actors came to entertain, musicians to perform. Nixon came to reshape perception. Every gesture, every pause, every chuckle was a calculated move in the long campaign to control how history would remember him. Carson, whose genius lay in unmasking pretension with humor, found himself staring into a performance more unsettling than any Hollywood drama. The memory of Watergate clung to Nixon like a second skin. Even as he joked, even as the audience laughed politely, the specter of tapes, resignations, and broken trust lingered. Carson once observed privately that talking to Nixon was like sharing a stage with the silence of 1,000 closed doors. It was charm, but charm shadowed by paranoia. On camera, Carson kept the tone light. He teased Nixon about golf, about his awkward dancing, about the small quirks that audiences found disarming. But the jokes never went too far. Carson knew the weight of power that Nixon once wielded, and the damage it left behind. The laughs were real but fragile. Behind the scenes, staff described a tension unlike anything other guests produced. Secret Service agents lined the studio, schedules were tightened, and every word seemed monitored. Producers recalled that Nixon never entered casually. He entered like a man crossing enemy territory. The air was heavy whenever he came in. You could feel the paranoia before he sat down. Carson understood that television could humanize even the most tarnished figures. That was the danger. With Nixon, America's most infamous president, the very act of appearing on late night risked rewriting memory. Johnny resisted outright confrontation. That wasn't his format, but his restraint told its own story. He gave Nixon space, but never absolution. The paradox fascinated Carson. Nixon wanted to be liked, to be seen as approachable, even funny, and at moments, he succeeded. His nervous laughter, his self-deprecating asides, these glimpses of vulnerability disarmed audiences. But Carson recognized the strategy beneath it. Nixon smiled like a man holding a mask he hoped you wouldn't tug. For Carson, trust was everything. The Tonight Show worked because audiences believed in the authenticity of the moment. Nixon represented the collapse of that belief, the reminder that words could be lies, that power could corrupt, that charm could conceal betrayal. Yet Carson also knew that having Nixon on stage was historic. It forced late-night comedy into direct conversation with politics, revealing that entertainment could not escape responsibility. By sitting across from Nixon, Johnny was asking the audience to confront not just a fallen president, but the fragility of trust itself. In the end, Nixon's appearances on The Tonight Show embodied the truth Carson sensed all along. Evil does not always arrive as menace. Sometimes it comes dressed in formality, shaking hands, and offering a smile. For Johnny Carson, Richard Nixon was unforgettable. Not because he entertained, but because he proved how easily power can disguise betrayal as charm. Johnny Carson spent 3 decades guiding America through the night. His laughter gave comfort, his pauses gave meaning. But his genius was not just in the comedy, it was in seeing people as they were. Behind the sparkle of Hollywood, behind the charm of music, even behind the authority of politics, he recognized the shadows. The guests remembered here were legends, yes. They were also warnings. Their brilliance was undeniable, but their flaws revealed the cost of ego, chaos, and power without restraint. Carson never shouted those truths. He revealed them quietly, in the way he leaned back, in the careful restraint of a joke, in the silences that said more than words. Legacy, after all, is not only built on what dazzles. It is measured by what lingers when the lights go dark. What do you think? Did Carson see through them all? Share your thoughts, and if you'd like more untold stories, subscribe to join us.